Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Yes Company with me, Sean Jobbins, and a big topic on tonight. We're discussing the economics of independence. We've got William Thomson from Scotonomics, all the way down from Scotland, as you guess. Then Mark Hooper and Tegid Roberts, who are supporters of independence and economists and entrepreneurs here in Wales. Mark, just as worth remembering, is top of the list for Plaid Cymru in the Bro Morgannwg, Pen y Bont, so the Vale and Bridgend seat for the forthcoming Senate elections are very likely to get in. So what he says actually is important and can have some bearing what's happening here in Wales. So welcome all to Radio Yes Cymru. Mark, just to kick off, you could tell us there's going to be a talk down in Cardiff on Saturday the 18th on the Tramshed Tech. Can you just tell us the details, when and where, and the tickets and stuff like that?
Well, you've done a good job there, John, by saying all the things that I need to say. So yeah, this is the second event we're doing. We're doing one in Glasgow the week before, and then we're coming down to Cardiff, and it's essentially just going to be a challenge to the status quo. Without sounding too, we'll get into the detail of this now, but we're of the view that actually currency is central to the independence project, and we'd like to challenge some of the norms and get that conversation started, because what we can't do is ignore it. So it's really important we get into this conversation, and it's not, as I've said to you before as well, this is a contested area, but it needs to be contested, and I think that's what we're going to be trying to do.
And then, William, you're coming all the way down from Scotland, and you're in the Barry March, I understand, so not your first time in Wales. And then you're part of Scotonomics, which is an excellent podcast discussing stuff like in the economics of independence. What's your position coming down and what's the situation in Scotland, remembering that this was apparently one of the things which tripped up the independence vote back in 2014?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Yeah, I've been following Welsh politics for a few months now. I was down for the rally in March, and we had an event which was talking about the politics of austerity the evening before the march in Barry. And that was a really good introduction, I think, for me to the audience to talk about the economics behind austerity, and basically laying out that austerity is a choice, and that everything we see that's happening now is a direct decision from the government. They have other alternatives, but they're choosing austerity. So with this event, we kind of thought, well, how can we extend that? And Mark and I really support a currency on day one of independence, an independent currency, a sovereign currency for Wales and for Scotland. So we just kind of looked and we thought there's so many things that connect both the movements. There's a lot of things that are similar. There's some differences, but it'd be a wonderful opportunity to get people together in Scotland who can hear a little bit about Wales, but talking about the idea of monetary sovereignty and currency, and the same in Cardiff from a Scottish point of view. So yeah, we've got loads to cover on the event, which will actually last 4 hours in total, because we've got a 1 hour kind of introductory masterclass on MMT before we get into all the details of monetary sovereignty. So a lot going on in the 4 hours.
So it's a chunky evening, and all welcome, of course, even if you're not convinced or you're interested, and to thrash the ideas. Now, Tegid, come over to you. I mean, William says that austerity is a choice. I'm going to just chuck this into you. I mean, no government wants to make cuts, really, or no government wants to be known as one which is just cutting down on hospitals and schools and money for disabled people. We've seen this week now with the Labour Party in Westminster. William says there's a choice, but I just can't help thinking, is it a choice? So I mean, it's easy enough for us to say outside government, oh, this is what you don't need to do this. But why does it seem to happen every time someone is in government, they do make these cuts? Is it because they're weak? Or, actually, are we just lying to people and we're selling them a dream which cannot be fulfilled? You're on mute, Tegid.
I'll try that again.
Yeah, that's it.
We've had roughly 40 years of Thatcherite fiscal policy now, through Thatcher years, through the New Labour years, definitely from 2010 onwards, and now with the Labour Party as we see it. The fiscal rules that the Labour Party have bound themselves to were the fiscal rules of the previous administration. So they didn't have to decide to use those fiscal rules. They could have decided not to right now. The austerity that they're bringing to the table now is completely unlike the Labour Party of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And I think it is a choice, and it's a choice that the Chancellor is forced herself into. And the Treasury itself, these have become the Treasury is now filled with people who only see this doctrine, and the doctrine being that austerity comes first, and to make sure that the deficit is as low as possible, to the detriment of normal working people and people in general. My wife has PIP, and it's been, a pretty unpleasant 5 or 6 weeks going through that nonsense. And all they've done really to do with PIP is they've kicked the can down the road, haven't they? It's a problem for next year now.
So we're just
and
saying
it's completely unnecessary. It's
Right, okay.
absolutely
So-
unnecessary.
to get into the economics of it then, I mean, and not in too much detail because of the time, but what you're saying is, the government, Westminster, so we've had two Tories and Labour now doing essentially the same thing. I'm guessing Reform would certainly do the same thing because that's where they're coming from ideologically. So, yeah, so again, so are they doing this because of ideology only, or can they do this without sort of doing all the cuts? Or, is it rather the case, if they don't do the cuts, will the markets, as they keep telling us, have a wobbly and then we're in a worse situation?
John, I think it's really important to put this in context.
Yep.
The government make all of the decisions to try and fit something called the fiscal rules, and Tegid mentioned them earlier. Now, these fiscal rules are completely arbitrary, and they can be set and they can be changed by whichever government comes into power. Fiscal rules didn't exist until basically in the Maastricht Treaty, and then there's only half the countries in the world have fiscal rules. This is just a simple choice, but they're incredibly important. If you set a fiscal rule, and the fiscal rule, the most important part of that, which the UK has, is that we won't have more than 3% deficit every year. So by the end of 5 years, the government has to balance its books. That's what the fiscal rule says.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing about economics that says that has to be set at that level. It's an absolute choice. It could be 5%, it could be 6%, it could be 10%. It couldn't exist at all. There's nothing certainly from a heterodox economics, which is where we come from, that says that there's anything substantial that backs this up. It is just a choice, and it's all about power, and it's all about dynamics. Now, the government don't necessarily want to do this, but they're advised to do it. All of the advice that they get says to them, if you don't do this and you run a deficit, terrible things will happen, right? But if you take a step back and you look at the economy and you think, well, even when that doesn't happen, the markets go crazy and terrible things will happen. And even, we've had fiscal rules since the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had we had higher productivity, higher growth. These are the things that get orthodox economists really excited about. This was before fiscal rules. Since then, lower productivity, lower growth. We've got higher inequality. We've got lower wages. All of these things are being set back by this idea of fiscal rules. And all it really does is ensure that the government doesn't spend as much money where it needs to be spent. And that is a huge problem. And that's why it is a choice. And the final thing to say is, well, all this austerity is going on, this reduction of PIP and this reduction of social security spending, the government pays tens of billions of pounds of interest on government debt, and that all goes to the wealthiest in society. So they're stopping money going to some of the poorest and the neediest people, but at the same time they're pumping tens of billions into the coffers of the wealthiest people in society. And this is a choice, and this is a narrative that we have to get across about Scottish and Welsh independence, is that we can do something completely differently.
So Tegid, do you think we can, with independence, we wouldn't be so beholden to the City of London, that kind of ideology, if you like? And I'm guessing it also comes down to, William, what basically the Bundesbank told the euro when it's setting up in the 90s. We want, because basically we don't trust the Greeks and the Catholics in Southern Europe to spend too much money, and they brought in a lot of these kind of rules for the euro, or the nascent euro. So, Tegid, do you believe an independent Wales could withstand all the pressures of the city and the city press and everything, and say, look, we're going to take any notice of you. We're going to get some kind of deficit and run a deficit. I don't. The fiscal was 6%, 6 or 10, whatever. Is that the idea?
No, not really. We don't need to have a particularly high deficit as long as our tax income is reasonable. So one of the challenges we have in the UK is we have an enormous number of tax codes. We have an enormous number of people in the UK that are avoiding tax here and there and everywhere. The tax take is 37 billion lower than it should be at the moment, due to tax avoidance and evasion. So, I would be closing loopholes left, right, and centre to close the gap. We need to consider also that, the taxes that people were paying, even in the 1980s were considerably higher than they are now. I mean, corporation tax in the UK, in the 1980s during the Thatcher years was 40 odd %, and now it's 20%. And, that's a huge difference, isn't it? Now, I'm not saying that we should just ramp up corporation tax to 40% on day one, but we need to be quite measured about what we do here, and if we are heading towards a deficit and a deficit is unpopular with the markets, then we need to be able to tell the markets that, okay, we want to balance the books. We want to make sure that people are healthy and being well educated and infrastructure is solid in Wales and in Scotland. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that, we close tax loops left, right, and centre and make sure that people pay a fair amount for the money that they have. Other countries in Europe have asset taxes. If you live in Switzerland, you pay asset taxes. Until relatively recently in France, you paid asset taxes every year. In California, you pay an asset tax. Nobody talks about California being in a place where the economy can't thrive, and yet they have asset taxes. So, we have to be a lot more clever about the way that we message this, because often, as soon as I open my mouth, communist, but the reality is that, if we want to get the books a little bit tighter than they are now, and we don't want to have austerity, then we need to be clever about the way we extract money out of wealthy people.
Okay.
For an example, now in Switzerland, right? So Switzerland is, I would never describe Switzerland as a particularly socialist country, but the support for disabled people in Switzerland per month is 10 times what it is in the UK at the moment. 10 times. So, and the proportion of disabled people living in Switzerland is very similar, or slightly higher actually, than in the UK and in Wales specifically. So, we know that politics is about choices, and economics is totally about politics. So, we've got to start being pretty clear on what we think should happen. Be clear with people about how it happened in the past. Even with very high corporation tax during the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, I don't remember the US economy particularly flagging. It was absolutely flying. It's only since we've had a very low tax environment in the US and in the UK for very wealthy people that the economy has started to flag. Properly flagged, because there isn't enough money, in circulation for, the lower and middle classes.
Mark, before I come up,
can I just, sorry,
yeah,
just going to jump in just if we can. So money in circulation is a really interesting point, I think, and it isn't that. So taxes don't pay for government services. When you're taxed, what happens is your money just gets wiped off. So you put your £10 into the tax bucket electronically, and in there's a ledger, and it wipes off your £10, and that £10 no longer exists in the real world. And the government creates money then to spend into the economy by spending on public services, on PIP benefits, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a conversation we need to understand about what tax is for, and tax is there for, I think, 3 reasons. One is to take heat out of the economy. So it actually reduces demand, which could cause inflation. I think it also balances, so it acts as an equality stabilizer. So in other words, it redistributes from the wealthy, away from the wealthy effectively, and then the public services paid towards the poor. And it stops people doing bad things like, smoking, drinking too much and stuff like that, that the state thinks are bad things. But it doesn't have to be considered the same thing. You can't start and think, if we don't have, it's Thatcher said to us, I can only spend what's in my purse. And we've all believed that as being true. So in other words, unless I get this money in this bucket here, I can't do it. And frankly, that's not true. The state finances in a fiat currency are not the same as a household budget. And the longer that politicians keep saying that they are, the longer they're dragging out all of the problems we have in this world, because they're not solving the problem. So when we say there's not enough money to be able to give people just the rights they need to live a life when they're disabled via PIP payments, for example, and they're saying we don't have enough money to do that, then that's for sure a political choice they're making. It's the same way they're saying there's not enough money to solve the climate crisis. These are political choices, and it's hugely detrimental for us to do it. So I think there's a bunch of stuff that will be useful for this event on the 18th to start to do, is as the minimum is for us all to recognize that economics is political. And actually, people are making political statements about the economics. So when the IFS say to Rachel, as they're about to do now, they're talking about now a £20 billion deficit. That's a political statement that's trying to force political action. The only thing is, I might, in fact, effectively vote for Rachel Reeves. I voted in the last general election. I voted Plaid Cymru, as you might know. A Labour guy got in the Vale of Glamorgan, and Labour formed the government. Rachel Reeves became the Chancellor. I didn't vote for somebody at the IFS. I didn't vote for these money market people who are changing everything in our economy. And that's where it gets to the real critical stuff about this. There are some big issues. Inflation is something we need to manage. So this isn't something where we're saying you can spend money like Billio. That's not what we're saying. But you can actually solve the societal problems that we have in Wales. And the UK could solve those problems today. But politically, it never will. And whereas, I've known Tegid for a long time. Tegid was the person who introduced me to the independence movement. Well, he actually suggested I join Plaid Cymru as well. So he's the problem child in this room at the moment. But one of the things that we've often spent our time talking about, the difference between me and him, is that I see independence as a route to solve our social problems, as Tegid does. But Tegid's been an independent supporter all his life, whereas I've come to it because the UK will not solve these problems. That's the political context that we need to frame this conversation in, I think. Sorry to cut across you, Sean. But...
No, so, William, go over to Scotland. I mean, so it'll be interesting to know where the debate is in Scotland now, from your point of view. I mean, obviously, the whole issue of the currency seemed or was blown up to be a big problem. I didn't see it as a big problem, but I wasn't part of the debate. What is the situation of the views of people now, and how far, if people are talking about Scottish currency once again, reviving the old currency you have, and how much is that taken seriously? Are the people actually implementing and ready for this? You obviously have your own banks, which we don't, but how far is that going in the debate in Scotland?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that if we would have won independence in 2014 with the currency proposal that we went to the public with, we would probably not be independent now. It would have been an absolutely unmitigated disaster.
Well, to stay with the sterling,
just to stay with sterling, yeah. It was effectively this idea of a currency union, and it was a deep misunderstanding of what a currency union is. And Scotland would have just continued to use the pound sterling. So all the interest rates would have been sent by the Bank of England. The Bank of England would have been in charge of all the financial decisions, would have been managing the risk of all of the banks, would have been deciding what the Scottish Government's fiscal policy was, because the government can't print any money. It would have to borrow money if it wanted to spend more than it raised in taxes. We were completely under the control of the Treasury, on Westminster, and it would have been an almighty terrible situation. And we might have even got to COVID, where the UK government said to Scotland, sorry, we're not giving you money. We don't have to, because you're just using our currency. You know, we've got no problem. We're not getting taxes from you. It would have been an absolute unmitigated disaster. And I think we're at a point now where most people, and I would say certainly a big majority of people, realise that we can't use the pound. And I think we've made big steps. But one of the big issues is a lot of people think that we'll use the euro instead. Okay, and that opens up a whole new host of problems. And I'm sure you'll have the same situation in Wales. And just very, very briefly on this, there's a choice. Wales uses its own currency, or it continues to use the pound that's issued in Westminster. That's the only options. It's the same as Scotland. You can move to the euro after you've had your own currency and you've proved that you can manage your economy and that you're quite close to the European average. But that's the only choice that you've got. So we need to start talking about Wales having its own currency or using the pound. The euro is the same in Scotland, same in Wales. It's not an option. So we've moved to that. So we've moved a little bit along the road towards our independent currency, but a lot of people still think that the euro is where we should head, maybe even missing out the idea of our own currency.
There's two questions I'd like to raise. One is, the practical steps of creating your own currency broadly, and also maybe on a tangent to that is, the Irish did have their own currency at a point. They then ditched that and went into the euro. So, I mean, if having your own currency is such a good idea, why did Ireland decide to ditch that and join the euro?
I think, if you don't mind, the best way to say that is that every country is different. There's nearly 200 countries on the planet, and 140 of them have their own currency. So I would say back to you, why does the vast majority of countries choose their own currency? Certainly some countries have decided to go with the euro. Ireland made this decision, 25 years ago, and a lot of people think it was the wrong thing for them to do. Some people think it was the right thing for them to do. So you need to look at the individual country, and you need to look at the institutions and the reasons that you would have your own currency. And for Scotland and for Wales, the main reason is that you want to do something very different from what's happening in the UK right now. And the only way that you can do that is if your government controls both its fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxing, and monetary policy, which is the interest rate and other elements of monetary policy and the effect that has on your economy. This is how you change the economy, and this is why having your own currency is absolutely essential.
So in terms of actually just getting to that point, I mean, what kind of steps does Scotland need to take? I mean, obviously the first one is to get independence, but I mean, you need to prepare before that, because I'd imagine, looking at foreign countries over the history, they tend to have 6 months, 18 months, even longer maybe, to go from adopting the pound or whatever it is to adopting their own currency. I mean, what stages would be for Scotland, because maybe you're closer to the situation than we are in Wales, to get to that point?
Well, I think you have to realistically expect the journey to be about 5 years. That's how long Brexit was. It'd be unrealistic to think that Scotland could separate from the UK quicker than Brexit. Might be, 6 months or a year, but basically within 5 years of a yes vote, you would have that full period to be able to run and launch on the first day of independence with a new currency. So really anyone who takes a step back and think, can a government set up something in 5 years' time?
Yeah.
So it's no real issue at all. And there's already work going on behind the scenes in civic society, not in the Scottish government, which is really interesting to look at this. So we'd have 5 years. I mean, my personal perspective is after 3 years, you run a digital currency, parallel currency, and people start having accounts in the Scottish pound. And then with over the 2 years, after a 5 year period, all payments are made in Scottish pounds. So very similar to what happened with the transfer to the euro. So this has all been done before. It's slightly different because we are leaving a currency union and creating our own currency, but completely manageable. But unfortunately, we have a government who's not putting in place any plans for this transformation. They're just leaving it to civic society to do that.
So, which brings me on to you, Mark. Barring something big, you will be a Senate member this time next year. We could easily be looking at a Plaid Cymru-led government in some form. I mean, I don't expect you to be able to deliver the Welsh pint in 18 months, but But besides that, what kind of thing do you think Wales should be doing in any case to shore up a stronger economy in general and also the financial side? I know you're setting up Bank Cambria. Maybe you can mention that. So, I mean, what kind of things do you think practically applied-led government should be looking at?
So I think this is slightly different from this conversation. So I think William, last time we met, characterised the Welsh government as being a super local authority because we're really restricted in terms of what we can do, which is the reason that people on this call want independence more than they want devolution, because devolution is so restricted. But Plaid have done a lot of work, and there was a policy document set out recently which was talking about an economic strategy for Wales, which I think is really central, and majority of that is focused on ownership. So who owns stuff is really important. And at the moment, the people who own stuff in Wales are outside of Wales. So we just have an extractive economy. And we've had an extractive economy for a long, long time as well. So I think we can get into the nitty gritty of that. But talking to the point of how do you start this process off, of establishing your own central bank and your own currency, and when do you start that work? That's not a job of government at the moment, because I think Plaid need to get in there first and need to start doing the work. But it doesn't stop the work happening. And it's in conversations. Tegid and I have had conversations about this for a long time now, and it's about once you start to get in there and see how government works, then I think you need to start the work. There's a book by an organisation called Commonweal who are involved in the Glasgow event that we're holding. And they wrote a book. It's basically how to start a country, a brief guide to starting a country or something like that. And anyway, the key thing, that thread that runs through it, is the central bank is one of the things that you begin the work on early, and you talk about it during the independence referendum campaign, so that day one, once you've won the 75% support for independence in Wales, that work begins in earnest. But you're not working off a blank sheet of paper. And there's a lot of evidence, and there's a lot of how to start it is a 5-year project or so. So it will take time to move away from it. And then there's some big conversations, but the work needs to start or continue. In Tegid's, in my case, I think needs to continue.
Okay, so Tegid, what are the sort of practical steps you think, apart from having discussions like this, obviously Wales could be doing? I mean, what are the challenges and the reason we'd want this own currency to get things done? I mean, what can we do now, and why do we need it?
I think we need to, spend time planning a new currency in Wales. There is no reason why we can't have when a lot of the former British Empire seceded from the British Empire, places like Malta and Singapore and Malaysia, etc., they were able to create their own currencies relatively quickly, within a 5-year period. Singapore and Malaysia in particular, within a 5-year period. And that was before the enormous technological revolution that we've had, from the 80s onwards. So if you wanted to create a new currency in Wales now, you could do it considerably quicker than you could, in 50, 40 years ago. I mean, you're able to create a completely, people are able to have bank accounts with the Bank of England now. For instance, I have a Bank of England bank account. I don't have an awful lot of money in, but I'm directly banking with the Bank of England, and there's no reason why Welsh citizens couldn't have a bank account which was in the Welsh Pint, given to them from the Welsh Central Bank immediately. So any savings that they had, they put in the savings into the Welsh Central Bank. They knew they would be looked after, and they would be guaranteed by the central bank, and completely bypassing retail banking. This was an idea that came up recently by the Greek economist whose name I can't remember. Yanis, whatever his surname is. That's right. So that's one idea. There's no reason why the central bank can't be part of the Welsh government, Welsh future independent government, but also there's no reason why the central bank can't be a floated company like Switzerland has. So Switzerland has its central bank is floated on the Swiss stock exchange. Well, we could decide that our central bank is actually a cooperative central bank, which is owned by the citizens of Wales directly, not owned by the government, but owned by its citizens. There's an awful lot of work that we need to do on what the central bank could look like and what it would do. But this is the time to be doing it now. I think it's Mark and I have talked about this for quite a long time, about what it could look like. And what's in our favor, I think, is the fact that technology is moving so quickly. There are central banks in the world that are run by certain large organizations. So you could ring up, I don't know, Tata Consulting Services and tell them, please, can you set up a central bank for us? And they would do that because they do that right now.
So I mean, obviously, one of the appeals for me would be creating good jobs here in Wales. So rather than seeing young people going over to London or whatever, we'd be keeping people here in Wales. So I'd imagine, would there be a Welsh stock exchange as well then? And, obviously Welsh tax authority and everything like that. What happens, just struck me, someone lives, let's say, in Chepstow, they live in Newport or Barry or somewhere, Wrexham. They think, actually, I want to use the English pound. I feel it's stronger than a Welsh pound. There's the cringe, but maybe same up in Scotland, anything of Wales or Welsh is by implicitly going to be rubbish. This is kind of arguments we have everything happening with the Senedd. Would people be able to opt out of a Welsh currency even if they live in Wales, or would they have to basically get on with the game?
If they're a taxpayer, they'll be paying their taxes in Welsh currency. So that would be the reason why they'd need to hold a currency. And people can effectively, I don't think currency holding is the same as it was previously when you would have, paper pound notes and, paper francs and paper pesos or whatever it might be. I think there's that world has changed and gone, and people use plastic to be able to, or not even plastic these days, but electronic means to be able to do their funding, to fund their activities. But the central thing is that at the point where our currency goes live, the taxes that the government will levy on people, personal taxes, corporation taxes, for those that are based in Wales, will be in the Welsh currency. So that's the reason that the currency gets validity, is the government setting the tax take in that currency. So that would be the thing that set it up. People could still have their bank accounts denominated in different things if that's what they wanted. But ultimately, people will be, especially, I would imagine, the border issue is a real issue, I think, in Wales that we need to consider. But at the moment, there's a border that people walk through. Tegid's already mentioned Switzerland. Switzerland has its own currency. It's not a euro country, and yet all of its borders, I don't know how many euro countries it borders, but 5 or 6, and people just walk across those borders every day. They transact on one side of the border, they transact on the other.
They commute into Basel and into Geneva, don't they?
They commute into Geneva because they can't afford to live there. So they live in France. They live in France and they travel across the border.
Can I just add to Mark's point there? He's absolutely right about individuals, but also companies have to pay corporation tax in the Welsh currency, so they have to start selling things in the Welsh currency to get that. So it's the blood that filters through your economy. So everyone just does it, and especially I think it's really important if Scotland or Wales at some point gain independence, more than 50% of the population to win independence will be bought into this type of economy that we're creating. So that gives the currency huge value as well. And then the final point, to build on what Mark said, it's not just the government taxes. every penny that the government spends into the economy. So anyone who works for the government or local government will be receiving the Scottish or the Welsh pound. So after a while, it kind of creates its own ecosystem and its own legitimacy internally. But certainly people can still save. People have got savings. They can save in all manner of assets. So they might want to choose the pound, but there's certain, or the dollar, but there's certain ways that you can encourage people to move. But after a period of time, if you're a bank operating in Wales, you have to operate in the Welsh currency. The same in Scotland. There's no choice about it. After 5 years, if you're a Scottish bank, you have an account at the Scottish Central Bank, a reserve balance account at the Scottish Central Bank in pounds, and that's the currency that you do business in. It'll be exactly the same for Wales, and a very natural, this is how every single financial system in the world operates.
And we'll have cooler people on the coins as well. So let's just get to the nub of this. It will be much cooler than what you've got with the UK coin.
I'd love to design them. Two more maybe obvious questions. One is, would a Welsh central bank, Scottish central bank, need gold bullion or something in assets to give it sort of depth? And the second one, what's the probability? I'm just thinking of viewers or listeners asking a question. Say Westminster, because it is by definition and by its being an imperial beast, I think, and will not be able to get over the loss of Wales and Scotland. Would they be able to use their currency, the English pound, then in any way to bully the Welsh pound or Scottish pound because it's smaller? I mean, would they be able to exert pressure on our currencies in similar way to maybe the American dollar does to other currencies?
I can give you a no and no if you want to both of those questions. I don't know if someone wants to give you a longer answer than that, but no, those two things just aren't really.
So you don't need gold bullion. We don't need like 3 tons of gold bullion or whatever and stuff like that.
No, it's just that's just an asset. The Scottish Central Bank will own a building, which will be an asset, which will be worth £1 billion. Gold's just a tradable asset. I'm sure, like every central bank in the world, Wales and Scotland will have will have a mixed asset portfolio, which might include gold, but no currency is backed by gold. That's ended in 1973, so there's no connection at all between the gold that a central bank holds or the government owns and its currency. And then secondary, this is it's such a good question, Sean, because I think people often talk about this idea of undermining the currency, and you only undermine the currency by selling the currency. Okay, you've got to get the currency first. Okay, and this currency only comes from the government via the central bank. So this idea that we can launch our currency and that the English pound could undermine it, well, they've got to buy the Scottish pounds with English pounds before they can do any undermining. So all they would be doing would be bidding up the value of the currency over a shorter period of time. So this idea that we can just launch a currency and someone just completely undercut it, it's just not really how monetary operations work. So it's just a typical kind of scare story that unfortunately we hear across much of the media, but no.
We can also decide if there were aggressors towards the currency, we can always decide to peg it to within a range to
to the English central currency.
So I say that again, Tegid.
Yeah, sorry, you froze there.
I don't know where I was.
So if they were being aggressive,
if another country was being aggressive towards our currency, then we can peg it. We can peg the currency within a range. For instance, in Switzerland, the Swiss franc was increasing in value dramatically during the global financial crisis, and that was absolutely whacking exporting companies in Switzerland. So what the Swiss central bank decided to do was to peg it within a range with the euro, in particular with the euro, in order to protect their currency. And there's no reason why we can't decide to do the same. So it wasn't as if the euro was being particularly aggressive towards the Swiss franc.
Right.
It was a different situation, but the Swiss franc is seen as a safe haven currency, and an awful lot of people were purchasing the currency, and the currency value was going up through the roof, and it was damaging tourism and damaging exporting manufacturers. So
Okay, Tegid Roberts, I can hear people shouting at this podcast, say, yeah, Tegid Roberts, you're always going on about Switzerland, but Switzerland is basically a haven for very dodgy money. It's a very unique kind of country. You know, it's almost, well, it is by definition unique in terms of financial clout, and it's been very dodgy history. So what about other countries? I mean, are you selling people a bad example in using Switzerland and not saying, I don't know, Slovenia or Denmark or Portugal?
I was
So I
using
mean,
it. I chose Switzerland because it's an example of a country that did something with its currency in
Yeah.
order to protect it, which was the original question. I mean, we
Yeah.
could talk about Iceland. Iceland has its own currency, and the population of Iceland is 500,000 people. You
Yeah.
know, there's plenty of examples of countries within Europe itself that are relatively small with their own currencies that are doing different things. I mean, Iceland during the global financial crisis had lots of problems with the banking system, and the IMF offered to bail them out, and they told them to get lost and decided to do things themselves. So Iceland is another excellent example of a small country in Europe that can handle its own currency, which is 1/6 the size of Wales, and it's able to do things and tell the IMF to get lost when it needs to, and do things completely differently, and jail its bankers at the same time when they misbehave.
Yeah,
You know,
I think
Iceland
so
is a really good example, and
Yes.
just to add to that, because Iceland was faced a position that Wales and Scotland might both face, which is there's some really bad big international event which puts their whole economy in jeopardy. Now, because Iceland had its own currency, it was able to devalue that currency. Now, the other option was to keep the currency at some kind of rate and undergo harsh austerity. If it didn't control its own currency, it would have had to go through perhaps a decade of Greece-like austerity. But because it had its own currency, it was able to say, we'll devalue our currency, but we don't have to go through austerity. Now, this for me is the most important point that I wanted to make on the show,
Right.
is that having your own currency allows you to make difficult decisions. Now, I'm not saying that having your own currency turns into this wonderful Shangri-La economy for Wales and for Scotland, but allows us to make these decisions. If there's huge impacts of climate crisis, we can manage our currency. We can say we'll devalue, it'll lower, it might cause a little bit of inflation, it might impact our importers, but it's our decision to do that because we want to avoid austerity. This is what happens when you control your own currency. You're able to decide how you manage your economy. It's nothing less important than that.
Yeah, and thanks, Tiger, for bringing up the Iceland example, because I think that is a very pertinent one. So it signs the population same size as Cardiff, and I know the time when Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister, was patronising them and saying, look, Scotland, if you're independent, you'll be knocked about by Iceland, And as you said, William, they actually jailed the bankers, and they're in a much stronger position. We'll have to draw the chat to a close, I'm afraid. This has been very interesting for me personally, and answered a lot of questions I've had. And maybe I'm more on the cynical side, or maybe I need to read more. So the event again, Mark, it's on Friday, 18th of July, 2025, in Tramshed Tech, which is next door to the Tramshed in Grangetown, and off Clare Road, isn't it, basically, if I remember correctly?
Penderys Street. So it's 5 till 9. So there's a introduction to MMT that William's going to be taking at 5 o'clock, and then the event starts at 6 to 9. It's going to be participative, so we want people to engage with us.
Yeah.
I know there'll be people there who don't share the views on it, which I think is a good thing. I think it's important we have these conversations in Wales, and I think the way William's last sentence is critical to this. This is about controlling what happens in your country. At the moment, the UK is being controlled by people, like I said, who we don't vote for, who we've got no way of getting rid of. But Rachel Reeves is absolutely beholden to them. And I think it says, and the decisions they make then aren't decisions that the people in Britain want, and the people in Wales definitely don't want them.
Yeah, and it's welcome to all people, whatever your political persuasion. Is it a fee, Mark? I forget, or is it free?
There is a fee on it. If there are people who would like to come and can't afford to come, that we do just get in touch. We can sort that out.
Yeah,
I think
but
it's
just
it's £5.
It's £5, so
£10
it's basically
and
not
15,
much
so
more,
people
isn't it?
so people can change. But yeah, all I would say was, it's 3 to 4 hours. No way are we going to change and educate everyone about the options and the choices and the different paradigms. But really, all we want people to do at the end of it is to go away and think, maybe there's something there and I'm going to start doing more reading. That's kind of where we want to go, because there's so little opportunity for people in Wales and Scotland to hear an alternative view. And we all know that there's something wrong with our economy, because we look outside and we see the closed shops and we see how poor our neighborhoods are. And we're just saying there's another way to do economics. And when we're independent, we think that offers the best opportunity.
Yeah, so independence is the vehicle to get things done, because I don't think the British state will or can. Boys, if you could send us a link to some of the things you think it'd be worth people watching or reading, and then we can put that in link to this podcast, which is on your usual podcast apps and also the Yes Come YouTube channel. William Thomson from Scotland, on internet. Welcome to Wales in 2 weeks' time. Mark Hooper and Tegid, always great to speak to you. Quite regular contributors to Radio Yes Company podcast, always interesting and important things to be said by both of you. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you at the discussion on the 18th of July. But keep tuned in to the Radio Yes Company podcast. We like to have these kind of discussions about the economy and discussions about independence. So keep it with us. Until the next time, from me, Sean Jobbins, goodbye.